Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Luke Johnson and Robert Schut. We are back with our fourth installment of Soren Kierkegaard's Philosophical Fragments. And I wanted to begin today with a little background information, but before I launch into that, I want to ask Bob if there's any detail or any sort of issue that he would like to clean up from last week, or any sort of opening salvo that he would like to put out there.
Oh, no, nothing, I think, from last week. Just this week is going to really be a challenging week for us as the speakers, but I think it's also going to be a challenge on the listeners as well to kind of listen carefully, because we're going to deal with some pretty difficult stuff today, probably one of our most difficult dialogues that we've had. So just kind of bear with us today, and we'll do our best to get through it.
Yeah, I don't actually think it's going to be fine. I think it's going to ask a lot of the listeners or whatever, but I think we've structured it in a pretty good way. So I actually think it'll turn out pretty well. We might have to split this up into two episodes given the denseness of the material, but let's just jump right into it. So one of the big problems that I've encountered in this conversation that I've been having with Bob, and when I've been talking to other people about Soren Kierkegaard's Philosophical Fragments, is that I haven't been able to give an description of what Socratic recollection is a recollection of. And I kind of felt like I was being sort of caught flat-footed on that. I'm not like an ancient Greek scholar or anything like that. And so what I did is I had to go do a little bit of read. Bob may have asked me last week, was Socratic recollection a recollection of beauty or truth or something like that? And I was like, sure. And, obviously I gave a thumbs up with a certain amount of uncertainty. To finally resolve the issue, I consulted a pretty decent website that looks like it has like some serious bona fides. It's called Philosophy Pages. It's put together by an instructor. He might be a PhD. His name is Garth Kimmerling. And he walks us through that, obviously Plato was one of Socrates' most remarkable students, but the way that he interprets the Meno dialogue is that it's a transitional text, and it has a Socratic, it has all the like intonation and language of Socrates, but really it's in this particular dialogue that we see Plato start to use the character of Socrates as his mouthpiece for a more positive, systematic, philosophical movement that ultimately sought the foundation of reality. And he says this on his website about why it's transitional, and I've covered this already. Although it is Socratic in tone, it introduces some of the epistemological and metaphysical themes that we will see develop more fully in the dialogues, which are clearly Plato's own. So, one of the issues that I believe comes up in the Meno is trying to understand, not just the nature of being able to recollect mathematical things. I believe there's the situation where Socrates has the slave boy recollect or try to solve for the square root of 2, which is an irrational number, but also trying to understand if the good morality can also be remembered in the same sort of way. And Socrates in that dialogue plays around with the idea that virtue is some kind of ability, and specific virtues such as courage, wisdom, moderation, if we have them, allow us to be fully human. Now the issue is that all people think that they're trying to do the good, but they don't necessarily try to actualize the good in the same way. And the explanation for this is that there's a disproportionate share of virtue spread around. But then the question then becomes, what accounts for this difference in knowledge of virtue? And so here we see how morality becomes an epistemological question. And we're, led back to this paradox that Kierkegaard talks about in the Philosophical Fragments, that Socrates brought up about how can we search for what we don't know, and why would we search for the thing if we already know it, right? And the only way to resolve that was through recollection. And this is where Plato comes in, is that that through recollection, we can get back in touch with these eternal realities. And we ask ourselves, well, what is an eternal reality? Is it that irrational number that led the slave boy back to, or is it something else? And Socrates seemed to hold the view that virtue could not be taught, that these eternal realities could not be taught. And the reason why it seems that was Socrates' case, because whenever he could attack teachers of virtue, the sophists, he would savage them. But Plato seemed to disagree and think something differently. And just to round out what Socrates, to account for the differences in virtue, Socrates seemed to hold the view that virtue is divinely bestowed true opinion and not rationally justified knowledge. Now Plato wasn't going to be happy with that, and Garthling says this about what Plato was really trying to get at with recollection, and that was the forms. And I'm just going to quote from the website. It's in the Creative Commons license, and you should all go check it out. It's called Philosophy Pages, or it's called is it called Philosophy Pages? Yes, and you should check it out. But he says this about Plato and the forms. Plato believed that the same point could be made with regard to many other abstract concepts. Even though we perceive only their imperfect instances, we have genuine knowledge of truth, goodness, and beauty, no less than of equality. Things of this sort are the Platonic forms, abstract entities that exist independently of the sensible world. Ordinary objects are imperfect and changeable, but they faintly copy the perfect and immutable forms. And just to go a little further down, since we really do have knowledge of the suprasensible realities, knowledge that we cannot possibly have obtained through any bodily experience, Plato argued, it follows that this knowledge must be a form of recollection and that our souls must have been acquainted with the forms prior to our births. But in that case, the existence of our mortal bodies cannot be essential to the existence of our souls before birth or after death, and we are therefore immortal. So, Bob, do you think that answers some of the issues that we were having with what Socrates really felt like he was recollecting? It seems like everything that I covered there, it seemed like Socrates, as Kierkegaard understands him, and this is the thing, right, is that everybody seems to use Socrates for their own end, is that it seems like Socrates' ideas led to the positing of the immortality of the soul, the pre-existence of the soul, and that somehow truth could be found within. But the nature of that truth seemed to, at least for Socrates, be somewhat more mathematical. And then when Plato sort of takes over, it becomes this more of this metaphysical, epistemological, moral thing, because it seems like Socrates concluded that virtue was sort of unequally distributed amongst people, whereas Plato thought everyone could sort of tap into it. So, I'm not going to sit here and give an elaborate treatise on the Platonic forms or whatever. I think for our purposes, that perhaps clarifies the discussion to some degree, or did I complicate it? What do you think?
No, I think that you probably cleared it up to a certain point, but just like everything else that we do, probably we've created more questions, but that's good because that's how knowledge works.
Yeah.
We answer some questions, and that induces us to maybe want to get more answers. But Plato's forms, I think, helps, and those even stay with us even till today. It comes to us through Augustine and others, that whole idea. So yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that for now, because we don't want to go too deep into Plato and Socrates right now.
Yeah.
We got our hands full with Kierkegaard, right?
Right. Because I think the next obvious question, right, would be, okay, we can recollect Platonic forms, but where do Platonic forms come from? And then you start getting to conversations about the Platonic one and mind, and we'll just take that up in another seminar series altogether. But at least I think we have a better understanding of the cleavage between Socrates and Plato now.
Right.
All right. So you want to take over and initiate our conversation on Kierkegaard today?
Oh, okay. I'll begin then with get my notes. And today, just to let everybody know, I have a lot of notes that I've created this last week when we decided to expand on our on the information on Kierkegaard a little bit. So forgive me if I have a couple of pauses here while I figure out what screen I'm going to look at. But for now, I've got the right screen. We're at chapter 3. And he titles it The Absolute Paradox, a Metaphysical Crochet. And he brings up the word paradox here. I think he may have mentioned it earlier, but he's going to try to explain paradoxes a little bit more to us. And that's good because paradoxes are very interesting to Kierkegaard. He uses them in a lot of his work. So we've got to have a good foundation of paradoxes before we continue on. And he says that it's the source of the thinker's passion. The thinker without a paradox is like a lover without feelings. So to solve a paradox is kind of like solving a puzzle. And those people that I know who like puzzles, it becomes somewhat of an obsession. And that's how Kierkegaard felt about paradoxes, that it was good because it made him think, it stimulated him to look for answers. And so he gives us a couple of labels of different kinds of paradoxes. That starts us off with the paradox of reason. The supreme passion of reason is to seek a collision. And through this collision, it seeks its own downfall. That's not exactly self-explanatory. That when you hear that the first time, you're thinking, okay, here we go again. And yeah. rightfully so. The supreme paradox of all thought is to discover something that thought cannot think. So Kierkegaard is trying to give us both ends of the paradox. They're kind of like two extreme things that for some reason they appear to be true, but at the same time you can't reconcile them with one another. That's kind of like a loose definition of a paradox. And so what he's giving us is the two extremes now as to how do we begin to put that paradox together. So he thinks of this as a collision because we have certain ideas that we hold to be true and other ideas that we also hold to be true. But somehow when we put them together, they collide. And then it forces us into rethinking our situation. And the paradox, the way he explains it in the book, so it's almost as if it were an exercise in thought, where reason reaches its boundaries or its limits. And this is the theme I think that he's going to take us through from here on out, as far as reaching the limits. Kierkegaard is going to try to bring us to the supreme paradox as it relates to God through reason and thought. And he brings us to this point because he brings us to the point of transcendence, where we transcend reasoning. And so issues that we're going to mention now, but we're going to clarify later. So we begin with the proposition, and the proposition is pretty simple. Man exists. The criteria of the truth in Greek philosophy, it was either thought, it was doubted, it was postulated, or it was made fruitful. And so that's pretty much the same, I think, as we look at philosophy today. Would you agree with that, Luke, that philosophy kind of fits in with some of those ideas?
I mean, without belaboring the point, I guess I'd want you to clarify in some way. I'm looking at your notes here. The criteria of the truth in Greek philosophy was either thought, doubted, postulated, or made fruitful. So for me to answer the affirmative or negative, I guess I'd need a little bit more.
Yeah, well, he doesn't really give us much more than that. He kind of just makes this bold statement. So you would probably get just my opinion of that.
That's what
he's saying. Yeah, he's saying that the truth we can think of the truth in different ways. We can simply think it. We can doubt the truth. We can postulate it or come up with conclusions deriving from the truth or to the truth. And we can make it fruitful by making useful in our life. So those are kind of pretty simplistic, kind of spur of the moment explanations.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that philosophy, despite its different schisms and movements, is essentially the same, or at least philosophical truth. That's sort of the thing that's seeking a limit. Yeah.
Okay. And also, by the way, whenever I get to a point that you want to start discussing those proofs and that, let me know. I'm not sure where you want to jump in with that. So you just let me know when that time arrives.
I will.
Okay. So he says, unless we hold to the Socratic doctrine of recollection, that every individual of man is man, which kind of is derived from what Luke was saying earlier about this recollection of thought. And then he says that sexus empiricus will make teaching impossible. So if we don't hold to this idea of the recollection, that sexus empiricus will make things impossible. So I had to, of course, remind myself, who is this guy again, sexus empiricus? And he was a skeptic. And he advises that we should always suspend judgment about virtually all beliefs. That's to say, we should neither affirm any belief or deny it as either true or false. And this view is known as the Caronian Skepticism, for those of you who are taking notes. Okay, so Caronian Skepticism says, I can't really decide one way or the other, so I have to take the middle of the road. I can't prove it's true, so I can't also prove it's false, so I'll just withhold my judgment on these issues. And I wonder if somehow when he was speaking about man, Luke, about holding on to this idea of man, that he wasn't somehow thinking about this syllogism that Socrates is famous for, saying all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Did you kind of envision that when Kierkegaard mentioned this idea about becoming man, about man is assumed to exist, man exists? Did you kind of think about that syllogism?
I didn't necessarily. I do remember that there's a footnote right there when he talks about man existing. Let me keep going and let me look at that footnote real quick and see what that footnote has a particular reference to.
Yeah, I don't think the footnote referred to this particular syllogism. I think it talked about another philosopher. I thought I had notes on that somewhere. I'll run into that. But yeah, go ahead. You can check that out while I'm going. And then Protagoras here also comes up in the text. He maintains that man is the measure of all things, but only in the idea that the individual man is the measure of others and not himself. So Protagoras has a particular idea which is similar to Socrates, but Kierkegaard wants us to differentiate between these two ideas. So Protagoras says that, or Protagoras, I guess you could alternate way, I always called him Protagoras, says that man is the measure of all things, and this means that man is, that truth is subjective in a sense. Socrates said that each man is the measure of his own self. But Protagoras, who is a sophist, also believed to have created the major controversy during the ancient times by making the statement, man is the measure of all things, interpreted by Plato to mean that there is no absolute truth, but that which individuals deem to be the truth. And this is, as I take it, to actually be the foundation. We might call him the first postmodern thought. Did you see a tie-in between postmodern thinking and between this idea that man is the, that there is no absolute truth?
I mean, I certainly did when you brought it up in your notes, and it got me thinking to myself, oh, there's nothing new under the sun. I think the interesting question is if postmodern thinking is monolithic in nature. Obviously there are a lot, I guess do you have a particular sort of postmodern theorist in mind, or?
Well, just in general, when I run into postmodernist thought in argumentation with other people, I always find this to be a common point that they all seem to bring up. There is no truth. There is no absolute truth. And so that's why it rings to me here that this is just being echoed in the books that I've read. But you're absolutely right. They claim there is no center, and therefore, if they all believed that there was no absolute truth, then that would be a center. But then again, I think postmodernism does internally collapse upon itself anyway. So I'll leave it at that point.
Yeah, I mean, my background in postmodernism is not great. I mean, I've done some stuff for the Noetic app on stuff that I guess would be considered postmodernist or whatever. I've looked at Barthes and Foucault and Derrida. They all get in little squabbles with one another and kind of form these circular firing squads and say, well, no, you think you're decentering things in this way, but you're actually putting the center here. And there's a lot of they didn't really seem to like each other a lot.
I like that expression. I've never heard that, the circular firing squad. That's very telling.
But so you're right. I would say you're right to say that there is this move to decentralize truth in postmodernism, but they're not. But they're not homogenous in their thinking about how to do that, and if they're successful with their different programs.
Right. Okay. We'll leave it. We'll have to do a podcast on postmodernism someday. That'll be interesting.
Add it to the list.
Okay. So now we talk about this very interesting way Kierkegaard paints this picture of a paradoxical collision. And we're going to take a closer look here. And he uses love to create a love paradox. The love begins with self-love, which creates a paradox. We've probably never thought of love in terms of paradox, but he's going to bring this to thought here. Until something awakens inside the person who is experiencing self-love, until something happens, this something is a longing for another.
Yeah, I think it's worth elaborating on this idea because the idea, right, that like thought seeks its undoing, right, that knowledge seeks the unknown, right, that seems very strange and problematic to us. But then what he does in order to make that idea more plausible is, like you said, to bring up this idea of love. Like many of us are motivated by self-interest to get significant others and partners and things like that. But in the process of giving ourselves away, or in the process of securing something that will give us affection, that will feed our ego or whatever, we lose our sense of self, so that when something negative happens to that person, we care more about them than we care about ourselves. Yet, to begin with, the whole thing was motivated by narcissism and ego. So this idea that the intellect seeks its own downfall shouldn't be that strange to us, because it seems like our narcissism seeks its own downfall too.
Yeah. And he says, if we think about this paradox in a situation of religious love, we begin also with self-love, and Jesus taught that we should love our neighbor as ourselves, as though self-love is a precursor to loving others, or at least it's an element instead of a precursor. I say self-love is an element of loving others, because you begin to treat the other person as yourself.
Right.
So I've known people who take that verse and say, well, I'm still working on loving myself before I can love somebody else. And I said, I don't think that's what Jesus really meant here. Yeah.
And by the way, that idea is taken up in greater detail in Søren Kierkegaard's The Works of Love. Yeah. Have you read that text?
I believe I have. Yeah.
It's in my opinion, it's one of the most beautifully written ones that he's done, and I hope we get to that one day as well.
Well, what I always tell people is my favorite book of Kierkegaard is the one that I'm currently reading. It's just the way it is with me. I'm just so fascinated by him that whatever I'm reading by him, that's my favorite book. So the paradox.
Well, you know what? Well, I was just going to say what I tell people is, if you want a look into Kierkegaard's philosophical mind, that the text that we're considering right now, Philosophical Fragments, is the best place to go.
Yeah, yeah.
If you want help for your existential despair, right, and probably the thing that's going to be the best medicine for you, I say look at The Sickness Unto Death. Yeah. And if you want to know about the joy of Christian life, the thing that ultimately you experience on the other side of it, I recommend Works of Love. So, because people come to me all the time, they're like, Luke, tell me what Kierkegaard book I should read. I'm like, well, do you want philosophy? Do you want something to address your existential dread? Or do you want to be fortified in your Christian life? And based on that, I make different prescriptions. Have you encountered that at all?
I've thought that, but and perhaps I have very casually said that, but not to the way that you were able to put it. What would you recommend for somebody who wants to challenge their Christian life, to challenge their Christian life? I mean, I have a book in mind, but I'm wondering if it's the same one you do.
I mean, to challenge. I mean, to challenge. I mean,
to challenge you in a positive way, to make you a better Christian, to provoke you into thinking more differently, in more depth to your faith.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think they're all that way, but I mean, I would, in a deceptive, maybe the present age or maybe the moment. I don't know. What about? Because they're so critical of the established order. Those two.
I would say,
I don't know. It doesn't sound like what would you say?
A purity of heart for me was one that because I think one of the ones that I've read in much more depth, because I've done a video on that, so I had really looked into that, and so that one really stuck with me. This is really a challenge to a person to have purity of heart. So you might add that to your collection.
Yeah, I would say maybe the most maddening one. The most maddening one might have Trembling, because because you have to balance the teleological suspension of the ethical that God is, testing his faithful servant. Maybe that one. It depends on what kind of challenge we're looking for. But purity of heart definitely presents a different sort of challenge, or another dimension to the challenge that you speak of.
Yeah. Okay, just so we kind of get sidetracked there a little bit, but it was worth it.
Yeah, sure.
So back to our text here. The paradox of love transforms the individual so that he's altered beyond recognition of himself or to himself, so that he no longer recognizes who he is. The self-love becomes overwhelmed by his love for another. Because we have to remember now, this is not a chapter in isolation of the other chapters. We're building on the idea of equality as well. So we kind of have to keep that piece in the bag as well, that love seeks equality here. So it may be a paradox, but it arrives at the extremes of the paradox by trying to reach that equality. In the same manner, the paradoxical passion for reason affects his self-knowledge, for his self-knowledge becomes overwhelmed, so his knowledge of self becomes uncertain and confused. Perhaps the underlying thought here is that self-knowledge is the beginning of reason. Like self-love is the foundation of love. So
Bob, I wanted to ask you something about that, and maybe you'll address it. And I was still looking at that footnote from earlier, so I hope I didn't miss something there. Is that I guess I wanted to question you about whether or not the beginning of reason, that sort of claim.
Well, I was drawing a parallel because he just got done telling us about love and how self-love is the foundation of true love here. Therefore, I would think self-knowledge would be the foundation of true knowledge. And I'm thinking maybe that's the parallel he's kind of leading us into without actually saying it
Yeah. And I guess the thing is that what we're doing here is we've got kind of a mix of different terminologies and stuff like that, because we're using reason and we're ultimately going to get up to the point where the reason runs up against something that it can't understand, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so the reason seeks its own self-destruction, but then in the process, there is what you're talking about, more essential true knowledge that's gained in that process. Yeah. So I guess what I wanted to do is talk about how reason might ultimately give way to true self-knowledge through the arc of this particular chapter.
Yeah, and the way I would explain this perhaps a little more casually and hopefully clearer is that self-knowledge seeks its own knowledge. It wants to become smarter and smarter and smarter. It wants more knowledge. But this is the very undoing of self-knowledge. Just like self-love seeks more and more self-love, but it does so in the process, it reaches out to the other. And so eventually in one way he says, eventually they self-destruct. Right. You lose one to gain the other.
Right, but there's going to be, with that knowledge that lust for knowledge, that lust that is driven by reason or whatever, that is ultimately frustrated when it comes up against that which it can't comprehend. Yeah. One type of knowledge may come to an end, but a new type of knowledge may just be beginning.
I guess that's always possible.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say here is this fixation with speculative philosophical knowledge, the system, the positive, and Hegel and other people's or whatever, that may reach its limit and come crashing down.
Yeah.
But a new knowledge and a knowledge of the unknown might take place. That's what I
would it be okay if I change one word instead of a new knowledge, we say a new understanding?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, because a new knowledge, I think, as we go through this, I think we find knowledge in a particular category and understanding a slightly different. So just so that I can keep my own understanding good. So sure. He says, if reason collides with what doesn't collide, that it unsettles this knowledge of ourself, right? So when he's talking about a collision taking place, but he hasn't yet told us what it's colliding with. So he asks us the question, and obviously he's going to answer it. The answer is the unknown. It's the unknown that we collide with, reason collides with. And it is not any particular thing. For now, let us call it the God, the unknown something. And for those who aren't reading along with us, the unknown has a capital U. And he does this throughout his writings. He uses capital U to emphasize the uniqueness of the word, or perhaps at times the divinity of the word. It's kind of hard to tell. But how does one demonstrate this unknown to reason?
Right. So that's where I probably am going to need to take over.
Okay. Before you do, though, let me just go back one sentence here. This idea of the unknown. So if we can think, to keep so everybody's on track and thinking clearly, knowledge always seeks not what it already knows, it seeks what it doesn't know. So that's the direction of knowledge. This is what it's basic understanding to the collision. We have to give kind of a direction to knowledge, to give a dynamic to knowledge, that it's seeking towards the unknown. It wants to conquer the unknown. So let me leave you there. Then go ahead. You can take over.
Yeah. So what a lot of well-intended philosophers want to do is that when they encounter this unknown or God or whatever, is that those who don't want to relinquish the concept of God want to take the time to demonstrate the unknown, the God's existence. And in about 2 pages in this chapter, we're actually not covering a ton of material today. I think we're only covering 7 or 10 pages, and it's very complicated. But Kierkegaard thinks that there's something really, really misguided about trying to use philosophy to prove that unknown, that God that we're coming up against. And about 5 years ago, I put together a little conference paper on this particular subject. And I I used two resources. One of them is Charles J. Kelly's Essential Thinking and Kierkegaard's Critique of Proofs for the Existence of God. And the other is an article by Whitaker, whose citation I seem to have left out. So I'll have to go and find that. It looks like I just copied and pasted Kelly's citation twice. Gotta love the memory saving of this particular Google document. So, in this like page and a half, 2 pages that Kierkegaard goes about showing that you can't demonstrate the existence of the unknown or the God, he gives what I think and what Whitaker and what Kelly say to be 4 different arguments for why you cannot prove God. Okay, that this is going to be something that's ultimately speculatively, philosophically, scientifically, empirically unknowable and will forever remain unknowable. And I've got a little bit written here. I'm going to try to walk through it, and I'm going to pause so like Bob can respond to it and give us his thoughts on it. Like I said, this is dated material. I don't know if I hold these thoughts anymore, but I think they will help our conversation. So the first argument that I was able to unpack there has something to do with this idea that Kierkegaard thought that demonstrations are either impossible or foolish. And the argument sort of goes like this. So the first premise is, we call the unknown that collides with man's reason the God. If the God does not exist, it would be impossible to prove the God's existence. It would be folly to try and prove that God exists if he does exist. For I would not attempt to prove God's existence unless I was already assured of his existence. In effect, this means one would be proving something that is already known, which is foolish. Therefore, the idea that the existence of the unknown, the God, could be demonstrated does not suggest itself to reason. Now, I've got some analysis of this argument, but should I give my analysis before we jump into a discussion of it? Okay, so
keep going on.
For reading. So if God does not exist and we attempt to prove him, we are wasting our time. Conversely, we would not try to prove God unless we were already assured of his existence, and proving something that is already known is a foolish endeavor. It seems right that it would be impossible to prove God's existence if he is in fact non-existent. So no protest will be made of that claim. However, premise 3, at least 2 counts. First, it could be easily contended that we attempt to prove things that we do know all the time. One could reason that the whole enterprise of proving things is to cultivate knowledge of the thing being proved. Secondly, it is not obvious that proving things already known is a foolish exercise. Here are some reasons that proving something known, such as God, might not be foolish. And I've got 4 of them. We may owe it to others to convey what we know, and proving something such as God might be the only way to do so in a convincing manner. We may need to prove God to ourselves, even if we think we know him, to reinvigorate our conviction. Just as scientists run multiple tests to prove a theory, we might knowledge of God via varied means in order to have firm knowledge of him. 3, proving God might be an essential philosophical exercise that we have to work out before progressing to other theological, ethical, and political matters. Proving God encourages contemplation of the divine and brings us closer to what we already know. Perhaps it is a means for reintroducing us to knowledge that we may have taken for granted. For all these reasons and many more, it does not seem foolish to prove something that we already know. So long as God's existence hasn't been disproved, all the proofs ought to be considered by those open to the possibility of a God. So what do you think, Bob? What do you think? Do you think proving God is foolish?
I would use the biblical expression folly. Foolishness is a little harsh. Okay. Folly isn't much different, but I think it's more the idea. I don't think we can take it serious. I think it's more of a folly. It's more of a game to try to prove God. And I know that a lot of people, and I myself included, I've gone through this whole thing with the proofs of God, obsessed with it. I've got a bunch of books on my shelf here trying to convince me how God exists. But one of the basic ideas here, people say, well, I'm doing this to increase my faith. I'm doing this so I have a stronger belief in God. And then I got to thinking about that, and I said, well, let's think of some theologians, and let's think of some theological works. Bible is one theological work, never proves God. Paul is one of the great mastermind theologians. He never gives us an explanation of where God comes from. None of the disciples, Jesus himself doesn't even tell us a proof for God's existence. And even if we go outside the Bible, the Tao Te Ching talks about God as being the unknown, the undefinable, the unnameable. So all these, I think, are evidence that to be a person of faith, you don't have to have a definition of God. So I think that kind of weakens the argument. Second, I have a bunch of arguments here, but we have limited time, so I'm going to pick and choose. I think my best argument is the same argument used against the ontological argument, which is that which nothing greater can be conceived by St. Anselm. And a lot of people use different versions of that. And from my reading, this is probably the best explanation we have, the ontological argument. But the argument against it is that which is more perfect, the concept of a thing or the thing itself? And so I'll leave the listeners to answer that question. Would you rather, on Thanksgiving, which we're about to have, would you rather have the idea of a turkey or a real turkey with stuffing and gravy? It's up to you, But that's kind of the Berkeley. That comes from Berkeley. But anyway, so what I'm doing is I'm plotting concept, which is essence, against existence. And I'm saying which argument then is greater, the argument of existence, from existence, or the argument from essence or from concept. In other words, if we draw a concept of God and try to prove it, we're going from the lesser to the greater. And we really can't do that. We have to go from the greater to the lesser, which would be Kierkegaard's point of view. So if we already knew God existed, we already have existence, then why would we go to the concept of God? We're going backwards, so that's why it's folly. That would be my short answer. I have a longer answer, but that's my short answer to it.
Yeah, and look, I think it's really well thought out. And, I guess what I'm trying to say, one of my concerns is that there might not be something folly or foolish about trying to prove God in, say, like a philosophy class or philosophy treatise or something like that, because maybe it gets people thinking about it to begin with. Even if the proof itself is unsuccessful, people thinking about the concept of there being a higher being to begin with, is that a real problem? I mean, I don't know. No. I mean, I guess I'm trying to say, and is there something irreligious about deeply religious people doing philosophical proofs? Because obviously people like St. Anselm and Thomas Aquinas felt like there was almost a spiritual activity in trying to prove God. They felt maybe in some way they were kind of getting in touch with a more fundamental existence by trying to contemplate God's existence. I don't know. I mean, obviously I understand why from one perspective it is folly, but I don't want to say that it's a completely worthless endeavor.
No, and I don't think Kierkegaard would actually say that either, because I think we have to be careful that we don't miss something that a lot of times when people get in debates, they miss. That there's two people that are arguing about the same thing, but there's something different. And what's different is the goal. Kierkegaard is speaking specifically about using arguments for God to prove God.
Right. Well, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now you're talking about using arguments for God to kind of shapen up your skills, to become smarter, to look at God a little differently, to kind of open up your understanding. And I don't think he would have a problem with that. I did it so that I know the arguments better than most people who try to argue with me. And
right.
So it is a good thing to do to learn about the arguments, but we must be careful that we don't put Kierkegaard in the wrong, set him up, when the straw man argument that, well, his goal is this. So his goal is simply saying, don't try to use it to actually prove God. You can use it to become sharper and smarter and just kind of let yourself think through these thoughts. Because I think sometimes we have to go through this stage in our life. So yeah, is that a good answer for you?
I think that's a great answer because it depends on what criteria I'm judging him by. If I'm judging him by whether or not the proofs are actually successful in what they attempt to do, then my verdict is going to be different versus like, oh, look, here are some beneficial side effects to considering the arguments for the existence of God. It changes my judgment. Before we move on to the next one, I'm just sort of curious, if you spend a lot of time studying the proofs for the existence of God, what kind of effect they had on you?
The same effect it had on Kierkegaard. As I struggled through each one of them, and I kind of picked the ontological argument as the closest and the best, in my own opinion. As I struggled with that, when I read Kierkegaard, it was like he opened up my eyes, and I said, wow, what am I doing? I'm just hitting my head against the wall. I like how Kierkegaard puts it. I like the context of how he uses it. And as we'll get, we can't give away too much, but that's where he takes us. I think that this thinking will bring us this collision, this idea of collision. I experienced the collision myself, of this intellectual collision where my brain said, I just can't take you any further, Bob.
Yeah. I had that, I specifically had that with the ontological argument. I think the physico-theological argument, or the teleological argument, or whatever you want to call it, I found that to be a really enlightening, rewarding way of looking at the world. And I find the cosmological argument to be similarly rewarding. But the ontological argument, I felt like that one drove me to just total madness.
It does. It
felt like I was being forced to concede something as the result of language and not necessarily be on the strength of the argument. So I guess my experience with the arguments for the existence is mixed. Logical one, it drives me absolutely insane. And I think, truthfully, I think that's the one that really gets a lot of people really upset. Because I think what people like Kant and other people will say is that the theological argument, the cosmological argument are all predicated on the ontological argument. So even if the cosmological and the physico-teleological one are rewarding in some respect, if you can't get that ontological one to work, then it all comes down like a house of cards. And if people out there, if you're going to study any one, I would say study the ontological argument, because then you'll begin to recognize it in some of the other arguments. Become very familiar. And once again, what it is basically, is that which nothing greater can be conceived. Is that how you would define it? It's that idea, or the person, or the thing, that nothing greater can be conceived. So no matter what you conceive of,
if you can conceive of something greater than that, then that's God, or at least you're not done with it yet. So it's kind of takes you into the eternal thought of, well, when do I stop?
Well, the major hang up with the argument, and we're getting off track, and maybe we should do a whole seminar on St. Anselm one day. And we probably should. It's not very long. We should look at it, but we could talk about it forever. Is that what was it? It's his reply to what was his name? It starts with a G, Guarno or something like that.
Yeah.
About it's the ontological argument. They talk about the imaginary island and yeah. All right, so let's move on. I think to this second objection to the trying to prove God. It's this idea that they're misnamed, and I think Bob sort of alluded to it already. That you never really prove God. You merely just sort of develop a conception of God, and you're sort of just working with a concept. And I'll walk us through this the best I can. And this draws a little bit from the work that is paired with the philosophical fragments. It's the concluding unscientific poster to the philosophical fragments. It goes something like this, and it has to do with the ontological argument. So premise 1, when we argue that God is in possession of all perfections and existence is a perfection, therefore God must exist, we have made a deceptive move. Premise 2, the following dichotomy gets set up. Either the supreme being was non-existent in the premises and came to be in the conclusion, or he was existent in the premises, meaning that he cannot come into existence in the conclusion. 3, it is impossible for the necessary supreme being to be derived or come into existence in the conclusion. The supreme being cannot be dependent on an argument for existence. So the first disjunct has been ruled out. Premise 5, in the second disjunct, we do not prove God since he is already existent in the premises. God's existence has already been assumed. The best we can do is logically develop the content of the God, such as determining his necessary existence. Not prove existence, rather, we can merely develop a conception's content. So, I mean, I won't read this here. I mean, I want to address the first part of this dichotomy from premise 2. I'll just talk about it, where the supreme being can't come into existence in the conclusion, right? And I thought that was pretty colorful rhetoric. If one really did conjure up a proof not knowing God existed when laying out the initial premises, but then concluded that God must exist, must we then conclude that God's existence was contingent upon those premises? That seems to be kind of absurd. I never really thought like the argument could somehow produce God. I mean, what do you think about that, Bob? Like I just thought this is kind of a silly way to frame it. Like I don't think anyone thinks that like we're magically conjuring up God when we prove him, when we make an argument, and therefore God is somehow subsidiary to the argument because the argument is giving God the existence. I just thought that was kind of like pretty radical rhetorical flair. What did you make of it?
Yeah, probably more that I'm not sure. I have to reread that again. Like I say, I have a lot of notes.
That's okay.
And sometimes I get lost in my own notes here. But I seem to remember if we read that area that Kierkegaard is talking about, I'm not sure that's exactly what he's saying. Is that God stays in abeyance, that he doesn't exist until we actually prove him. And I think you used a mathematical or geometrical concept there to show how that was possible. But I'm not sure that that's actually what Kierkegaard is telling us.
I could be totally wrong. And what Bob's alluding to is that in my notes, I speculated that we prove things all the time. Like I used the example of a subatomic particle, and like we prove it through math, but it's not like that subatomic particle came into existence when we were able to create the mathematical proof. It existed the entire time. We just figured out a mechanism to get to it. And so I guess that's what, to me, I don't think that the subatomic particle is predicated on it being mathematically derivable, nor do I think God is logically derivable from the philosophical argument that's put forward. Now, but again, maybe I'm creating a straw man for Kierkegaard and misreading him. How did you understand Kierkegaard on this point?
Yeah, I'm not sure which verse you were quoting. You didn't include the verse that you used in here, so I wasn't sure which verse you were quoting. So it was kind of hard. I wasn't able to derive exactly which verse it was, but I don't remember him saying anything like that. I think he was. I think if the one you're thinking about, I took that as being sarcastic, but we'll get to that as we go through this. I took that as a little bit of sarcasm to the person who believes he's saying, and then he turns it on himself. He says, well, if you're waiting for God to exist because of your definition, are you also waiting for yourself to exist prior to you proving your own existence? So I thought I took that as sarcasm from him rather than a statement. Okay, but we can wait till we get to that because I think I covered that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It might be that I'm getting a lot of that tone from the concluding unscientific postscript. I mean, and maybe that'll make more sense one day. I mean, then there's this other aspect to the disjunct, and maybe it's moot if we're not talking about the same thing. That, you know, he talks about if God is sort of existent in the premises somehow, that he can't come into existence in the conclusion. It just seems like we're dealing with very strange conceptions of existence.
Well, I would say we'd probably have to set this up as an informal logic to see if we can figure out what Kierkegaard is saying in a formal logic and put it in like a syllogism. Then we can see whether we fit the criteria for a valid and a sound criticism that he's making. Yeah. Right now, it's kind of hard because we're just kind of picking thoughts and ideas and trying to put it together in the same way.
Yeah, it's kind of tough because in this page and a half, he kind of mashes it all together.
Yes.
It's sometimes I feel like he needs explication, but maybe sometimes I've read too much into it. Let's move on to this one I thought is the third objection, if that one is not significant enough, and maybe I took him too seriously when he was being sarcastic. Now I know for certain that he talks about this, right? He talks about the criminal and the stone. Yes. Right? Okay. So he says that existence is never subject to demonstration. And essentially it goes like this. We reason from existence, not toward existence, regardless of whether we are in the realm of sense perception or within the realm of speculative thought. Premise 2, we do not prove that a stone exists. Rather, we prove that some existing thing is a stone. Premise 3, in courts of law, we do not prove that a criminal exists. Rather, we prove that the accused is in fact a criminal. So like the hidden premise here would be that proving God's existence is analogous to these examples. Therefore, God's existence cannot be demonstrated. And I think the big thing for me is I thought of two analogies that sort of subverted this idea that we don't reason toward existence. And again, I use the example of the subatomic particle. We don't have a subatomic particle, but yet our mathematics may say that one exists, and then we go and find it. We build a super collider and we go and find it. So it seems to me we have reason towards that particle's existence. So it seems like at least in that type of science, theoretical particle physics, that we are reasoning towards existence. And so that would be an example. And then to use his own analogy with the court case, I kind of came up with this elaborate scenario of someone who's accused of arson, and they try to say, well, you are the arsonist. But it might be the case that the defense might make the prosecutor prove that a criminal exists at all. Like that this wasn't just a coincidental fire that broke out, and has to reason towards the existence of a criminal before he can match the criminal with the person that's being on trial. So it seemed like to me in some isolated instances, and maybe I'm missing the point. It does seem possible to reason towards the existence of certain entities, both in the court of law and within the scientific paradigm. What do you think about that?
Okay, let me take the scientific one first.
Okay.
And I don't disagree with what you're saying, but I think I see it in a larger perspective. I took what you were saying and I tried to think how else could I see that? Because what you're saying is true, but let me see how I could package it a little differently. If I were Kierkegaard, how would I respond? In the science metaphor, we need to step back and look at science from a holistic viewpoint. Science first looks at existence in the form of nature, creates concepts and speculations or theories based upon what they see, existence. Then they come back to existence in the form of nature to prove their theories. So science itself as a whole, in a holistic manner, supports Climacus's viewpoint. We can't simply take one interval of the scientific process, examine it, and make a determination. We have to see the scientific method as a whole and judge from that point of view. In other words, what you've done is you've taken one interval of the scientific process. You've taken the back end of it. But how did they get to that point? They got to it from observing nature. And that's what science does. It comes from nature, goes into concept, and then comes back to nature again to prove it.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, because what I'm doing is I'm artificially cordoning it off,
isolating,
right? Because
yeah.
I was like, well, this person just comes up with this idea for there being another particle and then does a bunch of math and then gets to the particle. But in reality, what preceded all that math was a thing, right? Was like the existence of other particles that maybe were behaving in ways that were establishing the reality of that thing before it's mathematically proved. You know what I'm saying? Like for instance, with atomic theory or whatever, right? Like they haven't discovered it all at once. Like they'll discover electrons and then protons and neutrons and then protons and neutrons, right? But they can tell that there's something else there because things don't work perfectly. They can say we don't have the math or the tools or whatever to account for these little anomalies, but there are traces of something else. And so you could start to say that maybe the reality of the object is already there. And I've artificially not taken that into consideration in this example. Is that fair?
That's how I would look at it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I would agree or not, but that's how I would look at it. I would try to look at science, the overall project of science, and how it proves itself, what becomes. In the court of law, I thought that was an interesting one. But the problem I had with it, and I came up with another metaphor, a medical metaphor later, but let me address this one here first. If the district, I think you gave a little bit more in what I read here. You gave about they had to go out and prove that the defendant actually was on site. Yes. And therefore they had to prove his existence. But that's not really necessary to prove that he was on site. He would have to prove that the person only was in the location, not that he existed. And the fact that he was in a certain location presupposes he already exists. In other words, you can't prove him to be somewhere unless you assume there is a him to be somewhere. So we have to we have to go back to the beginning. You can't have a crime without a person, because only a person can be held responsible. But you don't prove the person existed. You only prove that the crime was committed by a person, or this particular person committed a crime.
I was just using with that particular example is that of arson and probably a bunch of other ones, is that it would be to just assume that a crime happened, that you have to reason towards the existence of a criminal, right? Like if I came home and my house was entirely burnt down, I'd have to do a bunch of forensic science to prove that someone, I don't know, put gasoline all around the house and struck a match, and it wasn't just an electrical fire of some sort. So it would seem like in that particular example, it's kind of minutia, but it seems like I'm reasoning towards the existence of a criminal, and then that is then
but what you're actually reasoning towards is not the existence of the criminal, but the location of the criminal. You're trying to prove the person who already exists was in my house and did this. You're not actually creating an ontological argument that there is a person and I have to prove he exists before I can do such a thing. You know, the existence is already assumed. You're only worried about putting him in your house, that as the district attorney would. He's not worried about proving to the jury that this person exists before you can actually convict him of a crime. You only have to prove this person was in the location. Yeah. Let me give you one here now. Let me throw one at you.
Sure.
Okay. This is my medical metaphor. A sick person or a diseased person goes to the hospital to get examined. The doctors don't try to prove that a man who has a particular sickness exists, but rather that a man who exists has a particular sickness. So they operate under the assumption that he does in fact exist. So they don't put you through a barrage of tests and say, well, first you have to prove you exist. The first thing they do is to make sure you have insurance. Okay, so that's probably part of the process. You have to exist to have insurance. But you see, my point of view is they're looking at the disease. They're assuming the person exists.
Yeah.
And they're looking and focusing upon the disease to cure the disease.
Yeah, and look, I think that and 99.99% of all court cases proceed that way. I was just trying to find something anomalous that showed us.
Sure, I understand.
Yeah, but I think in general what Kierkegaard is saying holds. You know, I think we're splitting some hairs about it all, but ultimately I think what he's saying holds. I think you've convinced me enough, especially what you had to say about the way that science generally operates. I might still fight you on that criminal on my framed arsonist one.
Okay, I'll compromise with you. Okay, so you got a.
But yeah. Well, do I have a fourth objection? Oh yeah, there's this fourth objection, and we might want to pause after this. This is probably the one that I thought Kierkegaard got the most right. It's a little longer. It's talking about Napoleon. So he says that Napoleon. So this is the idea that demonstrations rest on an ideal interpretation of the world, and I think this works. Napoleon, the individual, can be seen as the explanation of the French victory in Austerlitz, but there is no need to posit Napoleon as the individual from the event. It could just have easily been some other military genius. Thus, it appears that we cannot deduce the existence of something based upon effects. However, might the case be different with God? God acts so uniquely that we can identify God by his acts. Therefore, God is the only being whose essence includes existence. Kierkegaard says this is problematic, for the deeds of God are not immediately known. We have two options. A, we can interpret the world in theologically loaded ways. For instance, we can say that the world exhibits intelligent design, or B, we can merely intimate that the world exhibits some order, leaving it wide open to whether or not a God exists at all. If we go with A, God, we've already assumed the existence of God and are developing the ideality of the supreme being. If we go with B, we cannot reason from effects to particular causes. And what I mean by that is, it leaves it wide open. I mean, that physical law or a plurality of gods brought about the order that we see in the universe. It's kind of the Humean critique of the teleological argument. Therefore, God's existence cannot be proved via effects, either because doing so requires idealized interpretations that ultimately rest in the presumption of the divine being, or the effects are so minimally described that it's impossible to deduce anything as particular as a God as a cause of them. So I thought this was, I've sort of kind of stated how I feel about this. What do you think about it?
This is a difficult argument.
So you're I found this one to be the most straightforward. You're like, no, I don't like this one.
No, well, what I did in my notes here was I restated Kierkegaard's viewpoint here. So I think probably let's take a clear viewpoint of what Kierkegaard's actually saying, and then sometimes then an answer will pop out. If we read what Kierkegaard is saying, I think he would agree that the works of God are unsettled. The works of God are such that only the God can perform them. Just so, but where then are the works of God? This is him speaking here. Where are the works of God? The works from which I would deduce his existence are not directly and immediately given. Are we not here confronted with the most terrible temptations to doubt? And it is not possible, finally, to dispose of all these doubts. But in that case, it is not from the works that I make the proof. I merely develop the ideality I have presupposed. In other words, his point is that even God cannot be proven from his works. He must be presupposed. And that there is opportunity for doubt, the existence of God. So that's about all I have on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think if you think about it, like, look at people who do science, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I know really religious scientists, and I know really atheistic scientists, and people who held some beliefs in between. You know, there's nothing about the physical world that is forcing them to conclude that God is the one who fashioned all of this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like they either interpret everything as a result of intelligent design, that there's no way that this can all come together by blind chance,
right?
Unless they're already sort of presupposing the existence of God, therefore the proof is folly, right? Or they interpret the data in such minimal ways that there's nothing you could it leaves so many conclusions available, right?
Yeah.
Like everything from deism to agnosticism to atheism to polytheism. I mean, it's totally the case. It's just as logically inferable to think that God's made the world rather than one, I suppose, is what part That's of right. what Kierkegaard's trying to say here, right? Like,
yeah,
you know, we don't know. I mean, do we know how many people made our cars, right?
Right. Yeah.
You know,
and in one of my notes, I said that in essence, what we're doing is inductive reasoning. And you know what David Hume thought about that. We can never come to a conclusion if we try to use inductive reasoning, especially for the existence of God. So that kind of leaves us up in the air without a proof. But one of the things that we haven't really done, and time limits us, is to explain the difference between the essence of God and the existence of God, which we'll try to do a little bit as we go through the rest of this this part on Kierkegaard, because he gets into that. But a lot of times we spend a lot of time trying to prove the essence of God rather than the existence of God. And so we've got to make a distinction between that. And I think we go back to Socrates to do that, or Plato, whichever one. And my understanding of the difference is that if we were to look at a situation where we see a tree would be the essence, but wood would be the what's the other one? Existence. Yeah. So one is the the essence is more the purpose or the impression that we get from something. It's the meaning of the thing. It's how it comes to us through our process. Whereas the existence of something is the more the material of what it is, and it doesn't necessarily give us an essence, a clear essence. It can give us different essences, like wood. You can see a pile of wood, you can see a wood table, you can see a wood chair, you can see a wood tree. So we have the same existence, but different essences. Now, I'm not saying what I think. I'm trying to explain Socrates. Is that how you would explain?
Oh, I think, I don't know. I think yes and no. It might be a little confusing. I mean, if I were to trace it back maybe to the ontological argument, I haven't thought about this in a while, but just kind of to if I'm interpreting you correctly about this distinction between essence and existence, it would seem like essence would be more like the concept and the idea.
Yeah.
And the existence would be the reality of it. Right. So like in the ontological argument, it's something to the effect of, well, think of a being think of the most perfect being, no greater thing can be conceived of, right? Mm-hmm. And it's in possession of all perfections. And then you make this move that that existence is a perfection, right? So that there is, and this is the thing, is that there's some sort of separation between essence and existence in mm-hmm. terms of concept and reality. But I don't know. To be honest, we're doing some pretty maddening stuff, and I haven't done any preparation on this distinction between essence and existence. So I wouldn't want people to look to me as sort of font of expertise on this distinction between essence and existence, because we'll find that that's a philosophical problem that reduplicates itself.
Well, we'll only deal with it to the extent that Kierkegaard does. I was just kind of laying that foundation, because he does use these terms here, and we need to have at least a little bit of an idea as we go through it, what he means by essence and existence. So, but we can leave it at that. Do you think I'm far off by trying to understand it like that? I think you're right on that. That's exactly how I understand it. I was just using examples, but yeah, I think that that's exactly what Kierkegaard means here by it. Anyway, the way he's using the terms. The one is the essence is more the concept, and the existence is the, what was the word you used for, the other word you used for?
The reality?
Yeah, the reality. Yeah. I think that's perfect. Perfect.
As long as we don't think too hard about it.
Yeah, start to perfect for what we need right now.
Yeah. How much? So I've kind of said my spiel about these objections to proving God. I think after talking to you about it, I thought there was still a possibility for proving God, given the way that I framed my understanding of them earlier. But now I think after talking about it with you, I guess I do see it more as folly than ever before. Now with you and Kierkegaard on these issues, I thought there might still be kind of an opening with the ontological and cosmological argument. But to the course of talking about it, I'm like, yeah, maybe we should just leave all that silliness behind.
Yeah, good. I think we
made
progress. I think we made progress.
Is that good?
I think it is.
I mean, we have to throw.
Once we make the leap, when we get into the leap, then we'll see what's on the other side. So we've taken everybody up to the collision. Okay, I think this is great, because I think we've brought the idea, the knowledge right up to the end here. Now we're hitting these arguments, but we can't go any further. We can't break out of the arguments. So where do we go from here, from this collision? So this is going to be part B. So right, do you want to continue now or take a break?
I don't know. How do you feel? I feel like we got a pretty good flow. If you want to keep going, or else we can just start a new session.
How long we've been going? I know people get tired of watching. We could say if it's been how long?
Yeah, Why don't we take a 5-minute break and come back to it?
Yeah, that way they can listen to us in segments. Perfect.
Right, cool.
Okay. I'll be back.
We'll be right back.
Minutes.
Yeah, download the Noetic app. Bye.